1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you got it.
Hi, I'm Desiree Kennedy, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer and City Treasurer for the City of Kingston. And I'm here today to tell you more about the budget.
I gotta get myself together, got power pen. Dreams will come together if you say in your head. There's so much pressure.
Starting us off strong is Kingston's own The Meringue with the track Tell Me Twice from last year's YGK Music. Find this track and many others at CityofKingston.ca/YGK Music. Welcome to Tell Me More, the City of Kingston podcast. I'm Rob Hosier, your host and a communications officer here at the City of Kingston. To my left, safely physically distanced and masked, is our producer Paul Whittingham, also a communications officer here at the city. And of course, you heard from our guest at the top of the episode. So that's everyone here in the Councilor's Lounge in City Hall, but most importantly, I want to welcome you, our listeners. Thank you so much for joining the City of Kingston's first ever municipal podcast. You may not have known it by downloading and listening. We've just made history together, so thank you. Tell Me More is a podcast where City of Kingston leadership and staff will go behind sound bites and bullet points to tell you more about the larger context surrounding current issues, initiatives, and decisions. Really anything that is shaping our community. You'll hear the behind-the-scenes stories and better get to know the people who are working for you. So if you're looking for a broader municipal perspective, or just to spend some time with some really interesting guests, you're in the right place. We'll be dropping an episode on the last Friday of every month, so make sure you subscribe so you won't miss an episode. So now that you know our angle, what the podcast is all about, let's not keep our guest waiting any longer. She has calculated the exact amount of seconds this intro has taken and will wisely diversify into high-return tales of fiscal adventure. City of Kingston Chief Financial Officer Desiree Kennedy, who's going to tell us more about the budget. Welcome to Tell Me More, Desiree.
So tell me you'll take me home tonight. And tell me where you've been all
Desiree, welcome again to Tell Me More. How long have you been working for the city?
Well, I've actually been with the city almost 15 years now, but with my previous career, the city was actually an audit client. So I'd say too many years to count at this point.
So they were so impressed with your audit that they hired you?
I guess you could look at it that way. Yeah, I'd like to look at it that way.
That's great. That's great. So before this, you were an auditor?
Yes. I was an associate partner with KPMG Chartered Accountants here in Kingston for just over 20 years, and specialized in municipal auditing and accounting and consulting services.
You've always been pretty much in the municipal scene as far as your work goes.
Pretty much.
But now directly.
Yep. The other side of the table now.
So when you're in a social situation, you're out in the streets, or I guess within COVID it might be a little bit different. But when people learn that you're the city's CFO, what's the kind of questions you get? What's the first question you get?
Well, I think probably the most typical question that I would get, you wouldn't be surprised at, is what's going on with my taxes? They're too high. What's the increase for next year? What am I paying for? Those kinds of things. But believe it or not, I get everything from one end of the spectrum to the other. So I want to talk to you about a pothole outside my house, or I noticed the grass didn't get cut last week at the park.
Yes.
So they just expect, and I'm sure all city staff have the same thing. You work for the city, and it doesn't matter what type of question. You should know that answer.
We are truly ambassadors for the city, no matter where you work, and you say you work for the city. But that's hilarious. So did you solve the pothole questions?
Yes.
You got them to the right people. Okay,
yes.
great. So
yep.
it's again,
yep.
it's that
I get them to the right
ambassadorship.
spot. Yep. Remind them I work for finance, and then get those questions to the right person.
There you go. There you go. What does a typical day look like for you?
Rob, there isn't a typical day. And that's part of what I like about the job. So when I first came to the city, I remember having a conversation with who was going to be my former boss. And I said that was one of my concerns coming from public accounting into the city, that it would be something of the same day to day. And that's not what I'd been used to in public accounting. And I remember he kind of laughed at me at the time, and I didn't really think it was a funny question, but certainly after about the first year at the city, I understand why he laughed at me, because it is. Every day is completely different. I was just thinking about what I did yesterday, and just, 6 or 7 things, none of them related. Anything from reviewing an RFP to sitting on a steering committee for a capital project to, phone call from an agency with a quick question. So just all over the map. But
Doing
that's
a
what keeps it
podcast.
exciting. Doing a podcast, getting ready for that. Yep. Yep.
Checking my email screener to make sure I screen out Rob's emails before I ever cross the podcast. So of all those busy things you do and the variety of things you do, what would you say would be your favorite?
Wow. I would say my favorite is probably it's working with the people. I'm not one to sit behind the desk by myself and sit and work all day. I like to deal with people. And whether that's internally, so I love working with the staff that we have here at the city across all the 20 different departments, but also working with residents and business owners and other stakeholders and getting out in the community to do that. So I think that would probably be my favorite part of the job overall.
That's a great part of the job. And going back to adding podcasts to this list of very odd assortment of things, how many podcasts have you done?
I haven't done any. This is my first one.
This is your first. This is a day of first. This is our first municipal podcast. This is Desiree's first podcast. In preparation for the podcast, then, knowing it's your first, did you do anything to prepare? Did you?
Well, that's a good question, Rob. So, no, I wasn't going to do anything to prepare until I happened to mention the other night at supper to my son, who's a 17-year-old person who just loves to be on the computer and loves podcasts and gaming, that asked me, Mom, do you actually know what a podcast is? And I said, no. And he sort of looked at me and he said, but you said yes, you'd do it anyway. And I said, absolutely. Sure. I said, yes, I'll do it. So we then spent about, I'd say the next hour while he pulled up different podcasts that I could look at so that I would understand exactly what a podcast was. So
that's excellent. So you're way ahead of me at this point.
I'm well versed now. Thanks to my teenager, I'm well versed and ready to go.
Well, we won't wait any longer, and we'll get deep into this podcast now. And you're here to tell us about the budget. Now, speaking of 2020, really, from any perspective, it was a roller coaster. And yet, the city was able to maintain essential services as well as an AA credit rating with a stable outlook. Now, any listeners like myself who may not be familiar with this label and what it means is that basically each year municipalities undergo a rating process from an external agency. Now, ours is Standard & Poor's, or S&P. They look at your finances and your community to determine the city's financial health. So it's a comprehensive process, but what you come out of with is this really kind of comprehensive report card. And if you do well, it signals to investors and lenders that they can trust you. Now, does that sound accurate in my description of everything so far?
Rob, I'm really impressed.
Whew, okay.
That was entirely accurate. Great summary of our credit rating process.
I'm learning with the listener right now, but that's a huge win. That's a great win that we can maintain that. But obviously, it wasn't all smooth sailing. So, tell me more about how the city budget weathered 2020. I know it's a broad question, and it's an intentionally broad question, but maybe we can start with what are some of the challenges that you faced in preparing this budget? Okay,
well, thanks. And that is a broad question, but it's a great question. And I think that nobody there was nobody that wasn't affected by the pandemic in our community, including the city as a corporation, as well as all of our residents and our businesses. Major effects in terms of the pandemic. And I think, for the city, looking back now, one of the biggest challenges for us, so certainly from a non-financial perspective, in terms of reacting to social distancing requirements and provincial restrictions and what that meant for our services and how we were providing services. So a lot of change every day. And I think we really learned to, get up in the morning, see what the new provincial announcement was, and then react to it during the day. That kind of became our new norm. But from a financial perspective, I think the biggest piece for the city was the loss of revenues.
Right.
And you'll recall probably early on in 2020, after the March pandemic kicked off, if we can call it that. We didn't have recreation revenues, we didn't have parking revenues, no transit revenues, and so that was a big challenge for us, coming out of the gate. I think at the start, as we worked through the pandemic, certainly on the other side of that, if you're not running programs, if you don't have buses on the road, then you don't have fuel and you don't necessarily have costs, some of those incremental costs that aren't fixed. So we did have some cost savings that way that helped to offset that. But I think the other piece too was in terms of cost savings is that we immediately had to get into sort of cost savings mode. So what did that mean in terms of where else could we save costs? we had forecasted at the time about a $23 million loss in revenues, which is probably just under 10%, maybe about 7 or 8% of our total gross budget.
Right,
So
right.
fairly significant. So we started to look at different strategies, which we took to council for endorsement. We looked at things like, can we fund from some of our reserves and reserve funds, basically our savings accounts that we have? Can we defer things like some of our capital investment and use those funds towards some of the loss of revenues? In terms of staffing, we were in the unfortunate position we did have to do some layoffs early on of folks where we just couldn't keep them busy. We certainly didn't bring on summer students, limited some of our part-time hours, those kinds of things. And so we were able to find, I think, probably about $11 million, so roughly half of that in terms of savings, that we took to council and said, we need you to endorse these strategies. That also included things like salary increases for non-union and for council. Council passed a motion and they would not take an increase for 2021. So a number of strategies on the way. And we did that based on the information we knew at the time. So that was a little bit of the bad news. Sure. But as we worked through the pandemic, we also then found out later on, fairly late in 2020, that the province was going to support the municipalities. And so we learned that we did have some funding coming in terms of both the Safe Restart funds as well as the social services relief funds. And so because we had that new information, we went back and we readdressed some of the strategies that we could use. Some of the things like our cost savings, we continued on. We'd already saved those monies and we continued to look at those strategies up until the end of the year. But we also looked at things like our reserves and reserve funds and deferring some of our capital and putting the capital monies towards operating. And with the Safe Restart money, we were allowed to rejig those strategies a little bit and put some of those funds back to capital and back to our reserve funds. With a strategy that at the end of the day, we wanted to keep those longer term funds for what they were initially raised for. Right. So it was in sort of a last ditch strategy initially, not knowing if we were going to get provincial support. But when we got the provincial support, then we were able to turn that around a little bit.
Tighten our belts for the worst case scenario, but
Absolutely.
Luckily we didn't necessarily have to operate in that context.
Exactly. And so when we went back to council, we basically got the approval of council as we were coming up to year end, and still a few things unknown in terms of the amounts of funding, the criteria around that funding and the eligibility for those dollars. And so we went to council and council gave staff direction, and at the end of the day, to optimize basically that bucket of strategies, if you can call it that, that would obviously maximize the provincial funding, because we didn't want to give anything back if we didn't have to, address our operating deficit in 2020. We definitely did not want to have an operating deficit at the end of the year if we could help it, and consider what 2021 was going to look like as well. Gosh. So start thinking a little bit longer term as well, because we could see this wasn't going to be done January 1st, 2021.
Definitely.
And as we know now, we're still in the middle of it. And then finally, to make sure, as I said, that we were preserving those longer term funds for what they were meant to be used for. So we weren't really borrowing and putting off things in the long term to fund the short term. So I think you mentioned the A&A credit rating, and you summarized that very well. For us, that happens in the fall of the year. And so for us, it was a bit of a check mark from an external agency coming in, looking not only at our strategies as a city, but also the community in terms of what the community was doing in response to the pandemic. And so for us, it really was a final check mark that, you know what, you're doing the right things. You've responded the right way. And certainly very comfortable with what we were doing. So I think, for us, it certainly was an endorsement of that.
Yeah. It definitely reiterates that you're going in the right direction. And just for listeners' sake, too, bucket of strategies will be Desiree and my new consulting firm name. So look for that coming soon.
I like it.
It seems like, going through this, there's been so many lessons learned. If you could pull out, a few of them, is there any sort of general lessons learned that really kind of stick out for you in having to operate within this, restricted context?
Mm-hmm. I think there's been a couple things. One, we had to learn how to be really flexible. Mm-hmm. You just didn't know what was happening tomorrow. And that, again, that's for everybody. You just didn't know what your world was going to bring tomorrow and how you were going to respond to that. So we definitely had to be able to respond quickly, and as a team. And again, I say that not only we had a very strong team within the city and the staff that were trying to continue to provide services to the community, but strength as a community as well in pulling together. So it wasn't just the city. A lot of not-for-profit agents that were coming together and trying to identify what gaps were and fill those gaps. So I think that was certainly a lesson learned around how we could do that. The other lesson that I think that we're still in actually is that some of those changes, I think they're never things we maybe have thought about. We never thought about having virtual meetings, virtual
Sure.
council meetings as an example.
Right.
Council talked about that just last night about what that might look like in the
Seemed
future.
like a luxury versus a necessity.
Exactly. And all of a sudden we're doing it because we had to. So crises made us make some of these decisions. But now we're really in a spot where we could start to think, okay, how many of these maybe could stick? Maybe there is a better way to do this. And while we've been forced to identify that, maybe going forward, some of these things we could continue with. So I think we're in a good position now going forward to really start to think about that, both as a corporation, the city, in terms of how we provide frontline services, but also as a community, maybe doing things different going forward.
So roller coaster was a pretty apt term to describe the budget in 2020, minus obviously the fun. But despite the chaos of 2020, the city had its very first public engagement on the budget. This engagement, although a very worthwhile experience, was definitely not easy considering the context and everything we just discussed. Tell me more about why the city waded into public engagement on the budget in 2020.
So that's a really good question. And looking back, we were kind of thinking, why are we doing this in the middle of a pandemic? But a really exciting initiative, and I think for me, certainly something fairly new. The finance department doesn't get involved in a lot of public engagement, and so it was definitely breaking ground for us. But very exciting in terms of the process that we did. So council directed staff to look at doing a more detailed budget engagement, a public engagement process around the budget for the 2021 budget. So doing that in 2020. And they actually directed that in February.
Oh, wow.
Before the pandemic.
Right.
So we were
Just
quite
before.
excited just before.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So we were quite excited and started pulling together what that plan might look like. We were directed to come back in the summertime to council with a plan for what it would look like. And so we started some homework, did some research about what other municipalities did, looked at some of what we'd already been doing more on an informal perspective. And we pulled together a plan, which we took back in, I think it was June or July, we took back to council. And we actually, when we were doing that, we felt that this was more than just a 1-year thing, that we would just keep doing the same thing.
Right.
So we actually took a 3-year plan back to council in July. Figured if we were going to jump in, we were going to jump in with both feet.
Absolutely.
And we looked at it as a bit of an iterative process as well. So we tried to look at it around, there's an informative component, because obviously we need to, and we heard from the public, we need to provide more information around the budget process. How does it work? How do you come up with the numbers? What kind of input do you do? So people wanted to understand that. And we felt that there was an importance that they understand it so that they could provide us with some valuable input then as to how do we make this better? How are we more efficient?
So being equipped with the information before we can provide,
Exactly.
input. Gotcha.
Exactly. Yep. So there is a report on the Get Involved Kingston page that you can go and take a look at the report that went back to council in July. It provides a lot of information on our vision for 3 years. I think there's a caveat in there that year 1 we're good, year 2 and 3 we sort of held that we could still change things if we wanted based on what we learn. But also an iterative process that for year 1 it would be a little more about the inform piece,
Right.
some consulting piece, getting some consultation and feedback, but that we would become less and less about the inform and more about the consult as we sort of move through year 2 and year 3. So that was kind of the plan and the framework that we worked with. We were quite excited, and I think prior to March, we had some conversations about we could have a public open house, and we're going to have lots of speaker boards, and we'll have people that can speak to different things, and have booths you can come and interactive things. So we had all kinds of things sort of planned, and of course after the middle of March, all of a sudden that changed a little bit.
Yeah.
But we worked and we figured out, okay, what can we do instead? And so we did create a Get Involved Kingston page where we could put a lot of information on. We did quick polls. One of the interesting things, one of the first questions we asked was trying to get a feel for how comfortable people felt about the budget process and what they knew. And they sort of had to fill in, where am I on the spectrum in terms of I
Sure.
know nothing up to, I'm very, very, very well informed of what's going on. Very informed or extremely informed was only 15% of the folks that filled it
Okay.
in. So that was a message for us that, okay, we do need to provide more information and do a little bit more of the informed piece, and get some of those materials and those resources out to folks. So
It's always nice when those numbers reiterate your direction in the sense of, we were hoping to inform this first year, and here we are. First question, yeah, we need to inform this
Yep,
year.
exactly,
That's
exactly.
incredible. And so going into year 2 and 3 and through the engagement process more fulsomely, what are some of the things that you hope to learn about?
Well, I think what we saw from some of the results on phase one, as we've called it, and I think a challenge that we had right from the start is what types of questions do we ask, and what type of feedback do people want to give back? And I can give you an example what we struggled with. If I'm asking you to provide me some input on the budget, you could say to me, I want you to cut the budget by 10%.
Sure.
But you don't necessarily know what that means. So does that mean that, your road's not going to be plowed when the snow comes and you might have to
Mm,
wait a couple days before you can get out of your driveway kind of thing? Like what exactly does that mean? And so as we worked through it, we found that what we needed to ask people was not necessarily about the numbers. It was about what you're getting for those dollars.
okay.
So the service levels. So,
Right.
what do you think? Are we putting enough money into winter control?
Mhm.
And as we got some of that back, then we can turn that into, okay, what does that mean from a dollar perspective? And maybe it means we spend less dollars here and more dollars there. But it's really about getting that input on the service level. So what we're looking at, and we just started last week
Gosh,
planning.
brand new.
We just started, so a lot earlier this year, which is good because
Mhm.
we were running fairly tight time last year.
Right.
So starting a lot earlier. And then one of the first things we did is we're looking at some of the feedback we got last year to see if there's specific areas that we could drill down to more.
Okay.
So for instance, people were saying you should be spending more money on income support and housing and climate change. Those were three top ones. So we're drilling down. So maybe what we need to do is do a little more consult this year on those three areas and
Okay.
what that might look like.
Get a little bit more specific in those areas. What areas within those areas do we need to see a little bit
Exactly.
more resources allocated? I love the
Exactly.
idea of broadening the usage and service levels and how they relate to those numbers, how they relate to those percentages and such. And I think it's so important to see, like, again, that question, well, what does this mean?
Yes.
What is behind this and such? So far, I know we're early in the engagement process, obviously very early. Do you predict any kind of changes or updates to the process or to anything at all based on the engagement?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit early at this
Yeah.
point. I think in terms of priorities and where people might want us to be investing more money and focusing more, I don't see that as being a big change because I think a lot of what came out, maybe except for climate action, the other piece of it in terms of income and affordable housing, those pieces really hasn't changed.
Right.
It's come to light because of the pandemic, and
Yeah.
it continues to be maybe an increased issue because of the pandemic. So I don't think we'll see a lot of change in that. The other piece that we did last year, and I would like to do again, I think it's something we would do annually, is have a component around the ability for the public to come back and give us ideas on where they think we could do things better or more efficiently. Whether that's in providing frontline services or even internal services in some of our internal processes. So,
Right.
if you've got an idea of something that we're doing it this way and you think there'd be a better way to do it, we'd love to hear it. So that will definitely be a component that we will continue.
So within the engagement, we're in the informed stage, but we're also consulting a little bit. What kind of tools were you using to make these assessments and to really ask opinion?
So we really wanted to reach as broad a group as we could of the population. And I would say that was a challenge because of the pandemic. Absolutely.
Sure.
We couldn't do the in-person open houses or the pop-up things that we could do at
Hmm.
different locations. So that was definitely a challenge. But We did create a budget video, which I encourage people to take a look on our Get Involved Kingston page. It's pretty cool.
I agree.
Yeah, Budget 101. We did have the quick poll questions, as I mentioned, and that was really just to get a feel for, are people interested and what are they interested in? Who's out there that wants to participate? We did a full survey as well, and we tried to have sort of some easy questions that, you just tick a box, and then some more open questions where people could offer comments and that kind of thing. And then we had our virtual open houses. So not as great as in person, but we did our best, and we had a presentation, and then we opened it up for questions. So
great feedback on the open house.
There was. I would say it was a little bit disappointing in terms of the numbers of attendance.
Okay.
But we're hoping this year will be even better, and we'll fine tune some of the things in terms of information we provided, and so every year hopefully it'll get a little bit better as we work our way through this process.
Well, I think two things. You're finding what that information is. You're drilling down and you're figuring out what people need to know about. And B, I think overall with engagement, we're seeing a rise in attendance as the platforms get a little bit more comfortable. It was intimidating a year ago and even 6 weeks ago for some folks, but I think it's becoming more of an accepted way to conduct business this way. And so we're seeing those numbers slowly rise, and we hope that they do too. So that's great that you got a bunch of information from these tools and they were really effective for you.
Yep.
Going forward, do you see this after this 3-year period? Do you see this kind of just like a natural process in the budgeting process as the engagement piece?
Absolutely. I think this will be an annual process, and we'll get to a point where hopefully it'll just be pretty easy to launch and second nature, with a little tweaking every year. But I'd say at least the next 2 years, if maybe not 3 or 4, because I think the pandemic kind of slowed us down a little bit in terms of our speed and getting through some of these things. So, but I'd say in the next 3 or 4 years, it'll probably level out. But hopefully we'll get to a good spot where it'll just be continual from there.
Look forward to that for sure. So Desiree, cards on the table. I heard, a little bird told me, that you were a former on-air weather reporter at certain points in your early career. Is this true?
Well, Rob, yes, it is true. So my secret is now out. Thanks very much.
Before KPMG, before the city.
Well, before those, yes, definitely a previous life. And we learned quite quickly that I did not have a career in radio going forward. Just not a skill set that I had, but I at least got to try it.
We're bringing you back in podcasting. That's what we're doing.
Yep.
So this is your forum.
That's right.
So in the context of a weather report, if you could provide the 2021 budget forecast as a weather forecast, what would it sound like?
Well, I think like any weather reporter, it's like having a crystal ball. What's it going to look like? But I would suggest that we're continuing to battle a pandemic storm. Mm-hmm. And just like any weather forecast, we can only predict for probably the next day or two through this pandemic because things just keep to change time over time. But nonetheless, we are starting to talk about recovery in this community and across the province. Our vaccination process is up and underway, and people are getting vaccinated, and spring's coming. Hey. So I think we can look forward to sunnier days ahead.
I like that outlook, I have to say. I think everyone in the room likes that outlook. But overall, I think we can't thank you enough for joining us today, Desiree, and really explaining so much of the budget over the past year or so. And some of the challenges and some of the lessons learned and a lot of the ways to move forward. And we just really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much. I've appreciated being here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Remember to subscribe and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a topic for a future episode, tell us more. Tweet at City of Kingston using hashtag #TellMeMore or send us an email at tellmemore@CityofKingston.ca. For more on this episode, visit CityofKingston.ca/podcasts. Tell Me More is produced by the City of Kingston's Communications and Customer Experience team.
After all that municipal discussion, you have to be ready to get involved. And we've made it easy. Simply go to Get Involved Kingston. Get Involved Kingston is our online engagement site where you can share, participate, and engage with projects right across the city. From surveys to open houses to focus groups, there are plenty of ways to have your voice heard. So between listening to Tell Me More and engaging on Get Involved Kingston, you go from being an informed citizen to a woke citizen. Go to CityofKingston.ca and you can't miss it. Paul, are we still using woke? Is that a term?